Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and answering your questions tonight. American environmentalist Bill McKibben, who's visiting Australia to campaign for super funds and ethical investors to sell their shares in fossil fuel corporations. The editor-in-chief of the Financial Review, Michael Stutchbury, celebrated Canadian songstress Martha Wainwright, the first Indigenous member of the New South Wales Parliament and Deputy Leader of the New South Wales Labor Party, Burney. And one of politics' most enthusiastic social media users, Liberal Senator for South Australia, Cory Bernardi. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. And as usual, we're being simulcast on ABC News 24 News Radio. You can join the Twitter conversation with the Quanda hashtag. Well, our first question tonight comes from Bridget Meaney.
Last week, Australia saw a 13-year-old child dragged through the media for a thoughtless comment that she made in the heat of a football match. Essentially, she was treated the same way that Eddie Mcguire, professional broadcaster and president of Collingwood Football Club, was treated for his comments a few days later. Has Australia become confused as to what racism is and what constitutes a racist? Burney, let's start with you.
Oh, what a surprise. Look, I don't know that I agree with the premise of your question. Obviously, I've given this an enormous amount of thought. I've spoken about it a lot and heard a lot of people talk about this issue of racism in Australia over the last week, 2 weeks actually. And I think that in many ways we are inherently racist. I know that's a very tough thing to say, but I just think about myself and any other Aboriginal person that was born before 1967, and we didn't exist. We were not counted in the census. We didn't have citizenship. So I spent the first 10 years of my life as a non-citizen in this country. And I think about also, everyone, that famous, wonderful speech that Paul Keating made back in Redfern Park in 1996. And this is the crux of the question, or the crux of this discussion. What he said is that, imagine if it was you. He asked us to think about what it would be like to have our culture, our history denied and not understood. And that's really the question we need to ask. I think the other point to make is that in many ways, when you look at Australia, we are a shining example of multiculturalism. But when it comes to Aboriginal people, I think, you've got the whole history to deal with, and one of the most ugly parts of that was when we were scientific curiosities, and there are many body parts, whole Aboriginal people, probably my relatives, that lie in the vaults of museums in Europe and around this country. Racism is ugly, no matter how you cut it and dice it. But at the end of the day, I want this discussion to go somewhere. We see in this country constantly racism bubble up. Hanson, 2005 Cronulla, and now this. And then it ebbs away. And this is a chance for all of us to really have a good look at it, talk about it, and make sure that we as a nation say no to it.
Linda, briefly, very briefly, one of the extraordinary things that happened when Adam Goodes responded to the initial incident with the 13-year-old girl was that he remembered being back in the schoolyard. And he talked very passionately about this, very emotionally, about being in the schoolyard as a kid, and this brought him right back to that, when he was subject to racist abuse, and he did nothing, he didn't respond, and he feels bad about that to this day. These things stick with you, don't they?
They do. And just listening to you then, Tony, makes my heart jump, because we can all go back to that schoolyard. But I think Adam Goodes has just been so gracious and so decent in the way that he's carried himself through this time. And he's shown all of us as Australians how to be gracious and decent about this issue. But I was talking to some other very renowned Aboriginal sports people during the week, both rugby league players, and referring to those remarks. And they just said it cuts, my dad put up with that stuff. My mum put up with hearing that. I've heard that saying 50 or 60 times in your life. Maybe that person's only said it once, but we've heard it so many times it cuts us. And I think that's really what Adam Goodes was saying.
Let me just go back to our questioner because she has her hand back up. You want to respond?
I have no doubt that Adam Goodes was speaking from a place of experience, that he experienced that in the schoolyard. I suppose my query is with, this is a disadvantaged 13-year-old from a low socioeconomic background. She's basically a child who uttered something. Is she really the face of racism in Australia, the way that she's been treated as?
I don't think she is. I think and I didn't want to get into personalities tonight. I think this is a much deeper issue than a couple of statements. But you know what? I'm really sick of hearing, I'm not racist because I sat with an Aboriginal boy in 3rd grade. I'm really sick of hearing it was a slip of the tongue. I'm really sick of hearing, mate, I didn't really mean it. Those things are not good enough anymore. I don't have any particular feelings about that young girl. I think she's probably learnt the best lesson in her life, and maybe she started a conversation that we actually needed to have. But I do say to adults who have continued in that same vein in this country that should know better, it's not a slip of the tongue. It's not acceptable, and we are saying no to it. And that's my big message tonight.
I'll go to Cory Bernardi and I'll bring you back to the original question. So the original question was, have the Australian people become confused about what racism is and what constitutes a racist?
I don't think there's any doubt that these were deeply hurtful and racist remarks, as we've heard over the last fortnight. And it came home to me when I watched Warren Mundine actually yesterday on a Channel 10 program in which he described the hurt and the nature of this comment and how it struck to the deep core of people who are, have different coloured skin. But the essence of this question, I think, is about the treatment that this 13-year-old girl received versus the treatment that Eddie Mcguire received for, deeply offensive comments. And, for a 13-year-old girl to be taken into the police custody and questioned for 2 hours without an adult present, I think is a deeply troubling experience for anyone to experience. And equally, Eddie Mcguire, there seems to be, a cavalier approach. Well, Eddie's done the wrong thing, but that's Eddie, and I don't think that's acceptable either.
No.
And we've got to. I think it's right that we have a conversation about all of this. I think we have to have a conversation because if things are not able to be talked about, then they do bubble up and they turn into problems later on.
Okay, let's go to the other side of the panel. And Bill McKibben, you've spent little time in this country and you've spent time with Indigenous people as well during those periods. What are your thoughts about this story as an outsider?
Well, just as an outsider, of course, the hard part is, in a sense, that it's a 13-year-old. What you'd want to hope and think is that these kind of attitudes die out, that it's older generations and older, that time will solve these problems. But clearly nowhere does time solve problems by themselves. You actually, as Linda says, have to grapple with these issues. And of course, in the States, we have a long history of not grappling with them all that well and making progress fitfully, but then letting things subside. It's striking, though, in the last year around the planet, a kind of rise in Indigenous activism, often around the kind of issues that I work on energy and natural resources and things. People starting to stand up in new ways and not just say, treat us as we deserve to be treated, but pointing out that having successfully inhabited this planet for many thousands of years, there are some profound lessons to teach the rest of us about how we might make our way forward.
Michael Stutchbury.
Well, I think it was very powerful testimony from Linda there, and we'll all take notice of that. I was struck at the time when it happened. I was watching it at home, and Adam Goodes is, a wonderful representative of Australian rules football and of Aboriginal people. I was struck when he pointed to the person, to the young girl, and she was taken out, and I thought, well, that is really a very unusual thing to see happen in an Australian sporting event. He seemed to be shocked afterwards that it was a person that was young as 13. So I think these things have some jagged edges to it. Then we go to fast forward to the Eddie Mcguire incident, and he got himself into all sorts of trouble with what he said. It was a sort of shocking thing that he said.
Did you think it was casual racism? Do you think it was racial vilification? Both of those things have been said.
Well, I don't think it's racial vilification, and this new term, casual racism, is I think we're probably still grappling with. But I think overall, the overall episode is one that could be quite a powerful thing for bringing this issue to light and to the surface, and it's possibly one that, a bit like the Nicky Widmer St Kilda player maybe 20 years ago, that it will be sort of a powerful episode that we can advance the whole cause.
Martha Wainwright, I mean, sometimes powerful episodes do emerge out of sport. Jackie Robertson in baseball in the United States, for example. But you've watched this incident too. What are your thoughts?
Well, I just, obviously I'm completely an outsider. 13-year-olds say stupid things, but they're taught by their parents to say stupid things.
Yeah.
And I think that racism is cultural and taught, and it exists. And and it's hard to break those habits and those beliefs, but I think it does take action to do it. Because it's not something that you can just sort of say, kids, you really shouldn't, it's not good to be mean, or it's not good to be racist. It has to come from, I think, active education. I don't know what, it's a thing that we in the States and all over in Europe, and it's a problem. It's a really big problem, and it's not clear how to fix it, but it needs to be worked on. I live in Bed-Stuy in New York, which is famously one of the most. It's from that film "Do the Right Thing," the Spike Lee movie about 20 odd years ago, and it's a much safer neighborhood than it was in the 80s, and white people live there, but we're talking about using terms, words, and we have a really popular one in the United States, the N-word, and language is really powerful, and when you hear that kind of stuff all the time, it's really affecting and painful. And, as someone who, as a white person in the United States, I don't want to be on either side of it. I don't want to hear it. It's very difficult, and I don't know how we're going to fix it. It's really difficult.
Tony, people have to understand why the term ape and monkey is so offensive. To Aboriginal people, and I think African American people, because it was all that sort of Darwinism about the missing link and measuring our brains to see if our brains were measuring our furrows to see whether or not our brains were smaller, and it was about black people being a lesser human being, and that's why it's so insulting and so difficult. And I would wager that that young girl heard that term somewhere else. That didn't just come into her head. And I was also, and I hope I'm wrong about this in terms of Eddie Mcguire, I just wonder whether or not the comment that he made on that early morning show was something that he'd heard or said in the preceding week. I just wonder about that.
Isn't it up to all of us, Tony, to call it out when we hear it? If you hear racist words or racist slogans being chanted or said about or directed at individuals, you've got to stand up and say, that's wrong. Don't do it, it offends me, it's wrong. And I think there are too few people that are prepared to do it because they're worried about the implications of it. They're worried maybe for their personal safety, or are they going to get into an argument? Well,
in fact, that was one of the strange things about this, because around that 13-year-old girl, I hadn't seen the broadcast, but people who saw it said there were people encouraging her. There were people who were not stopping her. There was no one there saying, don't say that.
And there's no excuse
pulling her
for
up. And there's no excuse for that.
No.
Absolutely. Let's move on. Our next question is from Joe Ortenzi.
Yeah. I think it's hilarious that a Canadian is bringing this question forward. In light of the recent and major cultural insults of publishing the Yothu Yindi lead singer's full name and picture against cultural protocols, on the ABC, the nation's broadcast representative, what hope do we really have to minimise racism when most Australians are unaware of what those cultural borders are?
Okay, well, just to answer the ABC part of that question, we understand that ABC News believed this morning that they had permission from the family to use Mr Yunupingu's full name and photos. Later, when they found out that wasn't the case, wasn't the family's wish, they tried to avoid his name and image, although unfortunately it seems they failed to do that consistently. So let's go to Linda Burney for your thoughts on this.
Look, I am not fully aware of what took place this morning, but one of the very important cultural protocols everyone, particularly in Aboriginal communities that still have a very strong traditional base, is once a person has passed on, then you're not to use that name or that image for a set period of time. I think the challenge with the great Yirrkala man that's passed away last night is that he was such an important Australian, 1992 Australian of the Year, and I can understand why there would have been early confusion. I don't think there would been anything in ill-disciplined or anything meant by it in a way by the ABC, but it is certainly something that any broadcaster needs to be.
It's a dilemma, though, isn't it, for the, as you pointed out, for the mainstream media, when you want to celebrate an extraordinary life, a man whose achievements span not only music but education and, of course, activism and, as you've said, a fellow that most people would want to talk about. And it's not surprising, I suppose, that the mainstream media want to show his pictures, show him singing, show him talking. But how deeply does that cut with the communities themselves when that happens against their wishes?
It counts very deeply in those communities, and usually there is a name given to that person during that time of mourning. But it was such a sad bit of news, wasn't it, this morning when we heard of that. My wonderful image of this man, or the thing that you'll all remember is the 2001 Olympic closing ceremony, and you had Peter Garrett and Midnight Oil in the Surrey suits. You had Kathy had won the 400, and we were feeling pretty good as a country, weren't we? And then Yothu Yindi came out and sang Treaty. What a moment that was in the closing ceremony.
It sure was.
What a great Australian we've lost.
Let's go to Michael Stutchbury. This dilemma you're talking about, it's a dilemma for... what are you going to do, for example, in the Financial Review tomorrow?
I'd imagine we'll publish the name. It is a dilemma, obviously, but I think in this, when this has come
So you'll publish his full name, are you saying? You'll actually...
I'll go back and check on that as soon as we get out of here, Tony, but... I don't imagine that... I think in this day and age, we know in this social media day and age, that the name will be everywhere.
Yes,
and
that's
so
true.
If you think that that someone who is widely known in the community, celebrated, and they're passing away as a matter of great commentary, that will happen on social media. And I think it is a hard one. But
you're the editor of a newspaper, so you can actually make the decision whether to respect or not to respect the wishes of the family. Now, I know you've got a bit of a history in this regard, because when you were editor of The Australian, you also declined not to publish pictures of dead Indigenous people and made a case for the public's right to know.
Well, I wasn't aware of a request not to publish the name and image in this particular case. There may have been, but I'm not aware of that in this case. And as I say, in this modern world of social media and so forth, I think you'll find it will be everywhere. And we're here to really report the facts and what's happened in the world.
But that doesn't mean big outfits like yours can not reference the person in a different way that people would understand.
Well, these are things that have happened. It's a tragic occurrence. We're here to report,
It's pretty simple, though. I mean, you can still say Mr. Yunupingu, or as some people in the Northern Territory saying Dr. Yunupingu. So it's not as if you can't say a name.
The thing that strikes me is that it's such a beautiful tradition and idea. I would think what a lovely thing, to treat you know, once again, this idea of embracing differences, and you know, we are in a time of a lot of social media, and everything is becoming the same, you know. London looks more like Paris. New York looks more like, you know, any other town because of a Starbucks on every corner, because of you know, this concept of sameness and being all connected and being the same. But I don't know. I just what a beautiful thing to be a little bit different, and also to embrace that as an Australian.
Let's see what Cory Bernardi thinks.
That's very beautiful.
Tony, I would have been disappointed if watching the news tonight I hadn't seen images from the 2000 Sydney Games, if I hadn't heard the condolence motions moved in the Parliament. And so, yes, you can have sensitivity, but, you know, there is, I think, a great reason to celebrate this man's life and what he contributed to Australia. There is a national significance to that. How it's best handled, I don't know, but, you know, to have it passed and not have him pass and not have you know, recognition of what he's achieved and reminding us of those great celebrations, I think would have been very disappointing.
I was going to go back to our questioner. Joe Ortensi had his hand up.
Sorry, I'm a Canadian. I've only been here 5 years, but I've already witnessed many opportunities on how that can be done. When the first Australians aired, there was a statement at the beginning so that people who wanted to observe that had the opportunity to observe that. I think we already are accustomed to softening children's faces on the news. And we do that with license plates. We do that with identifiable objects. So there already is a practice of observing these, some may say legal, but they are also cultural norms. You can just as easily observe this other cultural norm without really going out of your way. It's just a new pattern. Large publishing organizations have methods. They have style guides. They've had style guides for hundreds of years.
Linda, should it be more deeply explained? I mean, is there a sort of spiritual element to this, of the spirit of the person being called back by hearing their name or something of that nature?
It is a deeply important part of the cultural practice and respect and mourning of the people of this great Australian's nation. And I think, given the conversation that we're having tonight, that certainly big news outfits should respect that and work out a way to do the honouring without insulting his family.
I just want to, Michael, just back to you. I mean, does this make you think twice? Does it make you think more deeply or more profoundly about the decisions that you take in this regard?
I think it's certainly worth, you know, from my own personal point, exploring. But as a journalist who wants to let people know what's actually happening in the world, and this is quite a significant event, my inclination would be to publish. But you know, I think it's worth exploring and hearing the arguments for.
That's kind of what we're doing. Bill McKibben. Have a thought?
Just that I'm with Martha. It's a fascinating. I mean, when we talk about, usually when we talk about, you know, we were talking about racism before and about all the things that we have to avoid and not. I mean, one of the beautiful things about a multicultural society is that there are lots of cool things to learn from how other people approach important things, like when somebody dies. You know, that's I mean. Multiculturalism isn't something, just sort of some like dangerous thing that we should just be spending all our time trying to make sure that we don't offend anybody. It's also, I mean, the beauty of it is that there are a lot of different ways of being a human being, and it's great fun to get to figure them out.
All right, let's move on. We've got a fair few other issues to talk about. Our next question comes from Seb Henbest.
My question is for Senator Bernardi. Senator Bernardi, do you still reject the science of climate change and maintain that this is the result of scientific fraud and a worldwide conspiracy of scientists? And do you think this view is commonly held by your colleagues in the Liberal Party?
I'm only guessing on which side of the debate you have an opinion. Look, I entirely accept climate change. The climate has been changing for eons, and there's no doubt about that. But I have never bought the alarmist hysteria attached to carbon dioxide as driving climate change. And there's, no consensus of scientists, I'm afraid. There are literally tens of thousands of people, scientists who have a different view on this. Now, over the course of time, a lot of the alarmist predictions and forecasts have been proved wrong. When will they finally admit that maybe it's not carbon dioxide? I absolutely support rational, sensible, environmental policies that are going to deliver real benefits. And no one in this room can tell me that the carbon tax, for example, is going to change the temperature of the globe one jot or one tittle. And that's why it's a ridiculous policy to pursue. Our policy, on the other hand, has actually real environmental benefits attached to it. We're going to clean up the waterways, we're going to have more trees, we're going to encourage energy efficiency. Those sorts of things are
And you're
benefits.
doing that in spite of the fact you don't believe that climate change is actually happening, caused by human...
See, one of the things, Tony, is that I'm the great healer in the Liberal Party. That I've brought Greg Hunt and Malcolm Turnbull and Cory Bernardi together to agree on a course of action that is going to have no regrets for us. It's going to mitigate carbon dioxide, which I think is a good thing. But whether that's going to change the climate or not, it doesn't matter. There's going to be resounding
I think you must have missed the
positive
fact that
benefits.
Malcolm Turnbull said this was a shockingly expensive policy that would get more expensive each time you ratcheted up
I'm sure,
the percentage
Tony,
that you tried to reduce emissions by.
I'm sure if you ask Malcolm Turnbull whether he endorses our climate change policy, he would say yes, absolutely.
I'm going to just the broader question. That Bill McKibben, no consensus from the scientists, says Cory Bernardi.
Look, this is, there's almost nobody left in the scientific community among climatologists, really who for the last 100 years hasn't understood this problem. The molecular structure of CO2 traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. Arrhenius, the great Swedish chemist in the 1890s, put out the first back-of-the-envelope calculations that are very close to what our supercomputers churn out now. But at this point, you don't even need to ask a scientist. What you need to do is say, look at the Arctic, where 80% of the summer sea ice is now gone. We've taken one of the 5 or 6 biggest physical features on our planet, and we've broken it. And the others are close behind. If you go out to Sydney Harbour and stick a pH strip in the water, it comes out a different color than it did 40 years ago. That water is 30% more acidic. Because warm air holds more water vapor than cold, the atmosphere is 5% moister than it was when Cory was born. The result is that we get drought and flood on a whole different scale. And, at a certain point, talk about adult responsibility. Look around. You guys just came through a summer that set every kind of record. You're having 100-year storms every couple of years. What exactly are we waiting to see happen here before we take
This is cherry picking to the extreme, Bill. It's just extraordinary.
This is exactly
what you ignore. What you conveniently ignore is that Antarctic ice is growing. You ignore the study that was released over the weekend that says it's chlorofluorocarbons that have the direct correlation to temperature. You're ignoring the fact that the global temperatures haven't warmed since 1998. And that's not me, it's the Met, it's the IPCC, it's a whole range of others that are saying
this. The last decade we've come through has been the warmest decade in human history, and we now know that most of the heat is going into the oceans, where the acceleration of that warming, as studies even in the last few months have demonstrated, is accelerating. Now, look, the science on this.
Can you just explain
the science on this is settled to the point where even people like George Bush or the CEO of Exxon are saying that global warming is real and it's caused by human emissions of carbon dioxide. The only people who don't say this anymore are people with powerful financial ties to the fossil fuel industry. So in this country, okay, can I just interrupt there? So actually, I'm the moderator, if you don't mind. So can I just interrupt there, and I'll pick up the point that he just made. I mean, you say that no one says it except the fossil fuel industry, but of course there was that CFC study done, and a peer-reviewed study done by Canadian scientists
that was released in the past couple of days, saying that it is CFCs causing it, not CO2. I mean, sometimes scientists muddy the waters as well, isn't that true?
Well, this is a huge field of study, and there are always people publishing new data, but the consensus among scientists is extraordinarily clear. Ask every national scientific body in the world, including the Australian Academy of Sciences. This is why we have scientists. I saw the statement the other day from Nikki Williams, the head of your coal board, saying, "I just flew over the Arctic and it looked fine to me." Okay, the reason that we have scientists is so we can do things like put up the satellites, the cryosat satellites, that demonstrate how much of that ice we've lost over the last 40 years. And when we lose it, when we begin to see these kind of changes, it's not like it's just some interesting thing that happens. This is what drives the weather around the world. The atmosphere is 5% wetter than it was 40 years ago. That means that in dry areas, you get more evaporation and more drought. Look what happened in the US last year, our warmest year that we've ever recorded. We had a drought so significant that the price of grain around the world started to go through the roof, and lots of people no longer had enough to eat. They couldn't afford it. The scientists tell us that from this point on, each degree increase in global average global temperature should cut grain yields about 10%. The really interesting part about this, okay, is that people who call themselves conservative are the ones who say, pay no attention to this. Radicals work at coal companies. People who are willing to alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere and just see what happens are behaving in a way that the most outlandish 60s radical never even considered. I mean, we are messing around with things that are at the absolute fabric of our planet, and we're doing it recklessly and carelessly.
I'm just going to bring in another question so that we can bring in the whole panel, and that question is from Elaine Jontek.
Last week on Q&A, philanthropist Bill Gates made a clear distinction in his criteria for his investments and his charities. He does not support tobacco industries, but he's happy to invest in resources, including fossil fuel energy companies. What does the panel think of this view?
Let's go to Michael Stutchbury, and bear in mind you're sitting next to someone who wants these corporations, or at least foundations like the Gates Foundation, to divest, get rid of their fossil fuel shares.
That I want.
No. You're sitting next to Bill.
Yeah, I think this is one of Bill's things, that this campaign to get investors to pull out of coal companies and so forth. I think you can readily accept that the global temperature has warmed, that the great majority of scientific opinion suggests that's due to the burning of fossil fuels and the emission of carbon dioxide. I personally always, I think you can accept that. I think you should also, from my point of view, I want to remain a little bit sceptical. I know you're not supposed to say, if you say you're a sceptic, that's a terrible thing in this area. But I think the sort of journalistic position should be just to be a little bit sceptical of, the capacity of the scientific community to project something this complex this far out in the future. And although the temperatures over the past 10 years, as Bill said, has been the highest on human record, the global temperatures have levelled out over the last 15 years. They are tracking now at the lower end of what all the models say. The article in The Economist pointed that out the other day. So I think we've got to remain open to how this thing's progressing. I think the idea that Bill's maintaining of a campaign to divest, to people to sell out of Australian coal companies, basically close down the Australian coal industry, is sort of verging on madness. I think people really have to, in Australia, have to realise the extent to which our living standards are propped up by this high coal, iron ore and fossil fuels generally. I think we should be, in effect, proud of what Australia's done to fuel the rise of living standards in East Asia, and that our coal and our exports have largely done this. This has been the greatest eradication of poverty, probably in human history.
So the coal barons are doing this not to make money, but to make development more prevalent in China.
Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, Tony. It's got a long pedigree. I
haven't met any Adam Smiths running coal companies in Australia.
And that if we did close down, say if we closed down the Australian coal industry, that would be not only a very big blow to the Australian economy and to the living standards of everyone here. There wouldn't be any Gonski school reforms, there wouldn't be any NDIS, for example, but I don't think it'd have any effect as well, because if we close down our coal exports, exports of coal to China and India and so forth would come from somewhere else. And you could easily even make a case, I think, that the net effect on the environment of CO2 emissions could even be worse, given the dirtiness of the alternative sources.
I think what people are talking about is not expanding coal mining in Australia. Currently, the plan is to triple coal exports out of this country. Okay, the scientists have told us that in order to avoid a 2-degree increase in temperature, which Australia signed on to as its target, we can only put about 560 or so gigatons, billion tons more carbon into the atmosphere. So at current plans for expansion, these Australian coal mines would fill about 30% of that world's carbon budget. Australia has somewhat less than 30% of the world's population. It's nice that that Mr. Palmer and Ms. Reinhardt and whatever can make huge sums of money doing this, but at a certain point, if we're going to deal with climate change, we have to keep most of the coal and oil and gas that we know about underground. And the good news is we now know what comes next. We look around and see that already in this country, wind power is economically on par. We see the real beginnings of a solar revolution going on here. And we look at countries like, say, Germany, okay, where there were days last summer when the Germans generated more than half the power they used from solar panels within their borders. If you can do that in Germany, and Munich is north of Montreal, think what you might do with a continent that was as blessed by the sun as this one.
Okay, Cory, Bernardi, I want you to respond to that first.
When Bill flies here in his wind-powered jet, I'll be delighted to endorse his views. The lady asked the point about Bill Gates. Bill Gates, it's his money, he can invest it as he sees fit. And I think we are blessed with an abundance of resources in this country. They create hundreds of thousands of jobs. They generate billions of dollars worth of wealth that spreads right through the country, provides us with the cheapest electricity available, and yet somehow you want us to turn our back on it. I think to do that would be absolute madness, and it would be a sheer folly for anyone in this country to pursue.
I just want to interrupt. I want to hear from Martha. I know you've actually been involved in campaigns to stop fracking in your state. That's slightly different, but it is a fossil fuel industry.
Yes, my biggest dream is that all the planes that I take, that those wings would have solar panels on them. I wish they did. I wish I'm from Canada, very much like Australia, and in the sense that we use they use a lot of their natural resources, and I'm embarrassed by it. I'm an idealist. I'm just an artist and a dumb blonde a lot of the time, but I think it has to be turned around, and I dream of a world that has more renewable energies.
Martha,
it's as simple as that.
Don't let yourself be intimidated. These guys are saying, oh, it's madness. Both of them, it's madness. What's madness is to take the course that science has told us will transform this planet. Madness is a temperature rise of 2 or 3 or 4 degrees. The only economic analyses we have of this, the biggest one from Lord Stern in the UK, shows that the economic cost would be larger than World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression combined. Madness is what we're doing right now. If you're serious about climate change, you got to leave that stuff under there.
We've got another question on there. Oh, sorry, you want to say?
I think it's interesting that you want to embrace these wonderful things that you have here, and it's embracing them, raping them, and taking advantage of the natural resources. Why not just be happy that they exist rather than use them, in a violent way? I don't know.
Well, I mean, you do have the problem of China and India and them needing power to fuel their development and all that sort of stuff.
But the infrastructure is in such a way that coal and fossil fuel is what we use. There is another way, but it's a big shift to make. and it's the harder shift to make, and people don't want to do the harder thing.
That's right.
But it's simply not sustainable.
Okay, all right. So we've got another questioner down on the floor.
How will
David,
we ever know?
David
Because it
Flint is
doesn't
our
work.
questioner.
Thank you. To the panel, most of our politicians believe that if they don't control our carbon dioxide emissions, the seas will rise and the dams will be empty and civilization will come to an end. Yet for the slightest reason, they will fly off to Europe to deliver a keynote address which could easily be sent by Skype or video. They have carbon footprints which are several times more than the average Australian. Is this a contempt of the average Australian? Should our politicians be made accountable, not just in confected elections every 3 or 4 years, but should they be made accountable 24/7 as we are? Should they be made accountable as Swiss politicians or the politicians of many American states are?
Linda Burney.
Well, I feel like I'm pretty accountable, David. I haven't flown off anywhere to give papers at the drop of a hat. In fact, I haven't flown. Oh, I did. I went to Tamworth and Armidale last weekend. That's where I went. It was freezing. But quite seriously, on this issue, and I've listened to what people have said, and I think that your premise about politicians being accountable is a correct one. I think in the main politicians are very accountable. We're required to be accountable by the very nature of the requirements we have on how we conduct ourselves and report that. But on this issue of climate change and CO2s, I just want to pull it back a little bit. You know, you say to, and many of you would have young children, a lot of you are young yourselves and people watching. What worries young people today? I'll tell you what worries them. The shape of this earth that they're going to inherit off us. And I think that that's a really significant thing for us to think about in this discussion. There's an old Aboriginal woman named, I can't say her name because she's gone now, but she said to a group I was listening to a few years ago, and it's just stuck with me so much, do you want to be an honourable ancestor? I want to be an honourable ancestor. And part of that, I think the most important part of that, this very moment on this blue planet, is how we leave this blue planet for the next generation. And that picks up all of the things in a very real way that people are saying. The point that Martha was making about renewable energy is something I think that there needs to be a lot more effort in. Yes, our future doesn't include coal, but that is not at the exclusion of looking at renewable energy. And if we don't, then I'm afraid we're not leaving this planet.
In the interest of moving along, let's hear from the other politician on the panel about accountability. I suppose you wouldn't really worry about getting on aeroplanes
I'm entirely
flying around the
consistent
world.
in this, David. You'll be delighted to know that what I say and what I do are entirely consistent. So, but I agree with your premise that it's very difficult for people out there to take their politicians seriously when they hear them saying one thing and then don't see them backing it up with actual action.
Okay, let's move to a very different subject. Our next question comes from Kaya Thorpe.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask Senator Cory Bernardi my question. I have a problem with the school textbook. It's entitled Learning from One Another, Bringing Muslim Perspectives into Australian Schools 2011. Why is Islam part of the syllabus for our primary and secondary school children? Muslims comprise only 2.25% of our population. Buddhists are more at 2.5%, while Christians at 64% are the majority. Yet Christianity is not part of the school curriculum. Why are we giving Islam preferential treatment? Why are we promoting to our children a cruel culture which has nothing but contempt for our democracy?
Cory Bernardi.
Look, I'm not aware whether how widespread religious teaching is in our public school system at the moment. I know certainly when I was at school we learned about different religions, and I actually support that. I think it is important to understand the religious beliefs of other people. And I'd hate to think that there was a preference for one to the exclusion of the majority religion in this country. So I'm not actually familiar with the intricacies of our school system in that respect. But I do believe that everyone should have an understanding of what makes our country so good. And I have a very strong belief that it is the Judeo-Christian tradition that informs our values, it guides our laws about how we interact with each other. And I'm a strong defender of that, because if we don't have people in public life that are prepared to stand up for those values, then they will ultimately be replaced by other values that are not as consistent with our democratic ideals.
So, just to sort of fill in the gap there, when you say replace with other values, are you saying Islamic values? Is that one of your... I mean, you've been on the record as saying you do fear these kind of things.
What I want to do is preserve what's good about our country. We have a great many things that do that. We have the rule of law. We have the equality. We have the equality between men and women. We have yes, I will. We have the separation of church and state. If we're not prepared to defend those sorts of things, we will see people try and replace them with others.
And to defend against what exactly?
Well, I don't want to see legal plurality happen in this country, and we've already seen demands for that. I don't want to see a state-sanctioned religion in this country. I want to maintain the separation between church and state. I want to see that men and women treated equally. I want to see the ethic of reciprocity, which is a Christian ethic that says treat others.
So where do you see the danger coming from, to put it baldly?
Well, we see it in submissions to the multicultural inquiry, for example, when the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils requested legal plurality and made that case. We see it when people are asking for religious law to guide their divorce settlements. We've seen it in the case of the government, the Labor Party, when they were trying to facilitate the establishment of Sharia-compliant finance in this country, which they denied at the time. I mean, these are there. They're not unique to this country. We're seeing it all over the place. And people like me are going to defend what I think are important principles.
I think the questioner put the percentage, tiny percentage, what, 2.5%, did you say?
2.25%.
2.25% Islamic people in this country, and you believe they're going to overtake or change the whole society?
Well, Tony... I know you're trying to get a rise here, but the point is...
No, I'm just trying to get to
I can only reflect what is on the record books. Why would the government have, at one stage, when Nick Sherry launched it, a book about understanding Sharia finance? Why would there be requests for legal plurality from the highest-ranking Islamic body in the country? I mean, whether they achieve it or not is not the point. But I'm not going to stop advocating for the things that are the essential pillars and the essential values that have made this country so great, including religious tolerance. There is no greater defender of religious freedom in this country than me. And when it's been attacked by Kevin Rudd, and when it's been attacked by Nick Xenophon and Bob Brown and the Greens, I'm the one that stands up there and defends the right for people to worship as they see fit.
OK, all right, Linda Burney. We'll come back to our question in a moment. Linda Burney.
I am about to summon up all the grace that I can to participate here. I want to read out to you what people do or say when they take the pledge to become a citizen of Australia. They can either do it under God, or they can say, from this time forward, I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. I used to be on the Board of Studies in New South Wales, and I was also on the Curriculum Council that developed religious studies curriculum in New South Wales. And I can assure you that Christian beliefs are part of religious studies. I also want to say that I am the member for Canterbury. 7% of the people in Canterbury speak Arabic. About half of those people are Muslim. And I also want to say that they are the most committed people, generous people, and the fear that you are talking about, Madam, and the sorts of things that you've just expressed, Cory, I find hard to understand in the place that I represent, and the amazing mix of people that are there. It is one of the good things about this country. In fact, it is what this country is, a mix of people from everywhere.
Let's quickly go around the panel. Martha, listen, I mean, Well, you would have heard, backlash against the Muslim community after September 11, and then after
everywhere.
more recently after the Boston
Yeah.
marathon bombings, etc., etc. Do you hear this kind of thing reflected in US society?
I think it's lessened since I would hope that it has lessened since right after 9/11. A fear of Islam. These are countries that are built on immigration. That's sort of the point. And if that's the point of the country, and immigrants are allowed to come in, that's the idea. And I don't. And also, I think that the way that that Islam was framed, when you're talking about it as being, a potentially, dangerous and malicious religion, I think that you could probably say those things about all religions, and at one point, or one element of them, Christians did terrible things, so I don't think that is. You can only sort of point the finger at the bad parts of one religion.
Let's see. Stutch, you have a brief comment to make on this?
Well, I think Australia has been, a very successful multicultural society, and we've absorbed people from all different ways of life and different backgrounds very successfully. Of course, the Islamic thing has the extra edge on it because we have been through September 11 and aspects to do with that. So it's under. Can be quite a controversial thing at times. But I think overall, Australia's done very well to absorb immigrants from the Islamic faith.
And briefly, Bill?
Let me just, say I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so that heritage is important to me. But I think the premise of the question is absurd. Islam is not a cruel religion. It's one of the great religions on our planet. The second thing is just to bring it full circle to where we started about racism and the history of Australia, which I don't know that much about, but listening to this conversation, the idea that Cory said that Australia is, defined by its Judeo-Christian heritage is probably true in certain ways, but it has a long history that predates its Judeo-Christian heritage, and the point, just going back to where we were before, is there's a lot to learn from all the approaches that everybody's brought to this world. And as I say, I'm a Sunday school teacher, but I'm unthreatened. In fact, enjoy working with my Sunday school class to help people understand all the ways that God's been perceived over time, and helping them to understand what God is calling us to do in the here and now, to deal with, among other things, the incredible threats to the creation that we've been left to steward.
Okay, we have time for one last question. It's from Nicole Ganane.
My question's for Martha. The relationships between mothers and daughters are often fraught, particularly through the teenage years. Becoming a parent helps us to develop a sense of empathy for our mothers. If you could turn back time, what would you have done differently with your mother?
I would have been nicer to her,
For anyone who doesn't know, your mother was the wonderful Kate McGarrigle, one of the great folk singers of all time.
Yes, right. My mother was a great singer, and she died prematurely at 63 a few years ago, and certainly, and you talk about mothers and daughters, it's really true, because my brother Rufus we're all musicians in our family, and my mom and Rufus, he was always good to her, and I was hard on her, and I thought that I had all the time in the world to make it up to her, and only when she became sick that I turned around and spent every moment that I could with her, and tried to make up for any meanness I inflicted upon her, but I know that she died right when I had a baby, and so there was a transference of life, and so that is what I'm holding on to, and I always am asking her for her advice and how she would do it, and so far, so good.
How much, just very briefly, how much did her death affect the musical clan? Because I think she was a driving force behind a lot of your collaborations, and especially at Christmas time.
Yes, yes. Well, yes, she brought all of us together for these bloody Christmas shows that she would make us do.
At Carnegie Hall.
At Carnegie Hall and Royal Albert Hall, and we came here 10 years ago and toured this country. But you know, she would. You know, she was a matriarch, and she's gone now. But Rufus, my brother, and I continue to sing her songs, and that's all we can do.
All right, we think we're going to hear a little bit from you in a moment, so I won't press you anymore because that is all we have time for tonight. Talking anyway. Please thank our panel, Bill McKibben, Michael Stutchbury, Martha Wainwright, Linda Burney and Cory Bernardi. Martha, that's your cue. All right, thank you very much. And next Monday, we will be joined by former federal opposition leader Mark Latham, the Minister for Trade, Craig Emerson, the Shadow Minister for Communications, Malcolm Turnbull, journalist and commentator Jennifer Hewitt, and Saudi Arabia's first female filmmaker, Haifa El Mansour. Well, we'll leave you tonight with Martha Wainwright, who is joined by the band Brighter Later to sing the beautiful song Proserpina, the last song that Martha's mother, Kate McGarrigle, wrote. Until next week's Q&A, good night.
Proserpina, Proserpina, come home to mama, come home to mama. Proserpina, Proserpina, come home to mother, come home to mama now. I shall punish the earth, I shall turn down the heat, I shall take away every morsel to eat, I shall turn every field into stone, where I walk crying alone, crying for Proserpina, Proserpina, come home to mama, come home to mama now. Proserpina, Proserpina, go home to your mother, go home to Hera. Proserpina, Proserpina, go home to your mother, go home to Hera. She has punished the earth, she has turned down the heat, she has taken away every morsel to eat, she has turned every field into stone, where she was crying alone, crying for Proserpina, Proserpina, come home to mama, come home to mama. Proserpina, Proserpina, come home to mama, come home to mama now. Proserpina, Proserpina, come home to mama, come home to mama. Proserpina, Proserpina, come home to mother, come home to mama.